When I turned the key and pushed the front door open that Thanksgiving night, the hinges sang a clean, familiar note I'd replayed in my head for months. A year on the rig had burrowed salt into my knuckles and lines into my face, but it never touched the picture I carried to survive those graveyard shifts. My son charging into my arms, my daughter's shriek of laughter, my wife's tears cresting into relief as she pressed her cheek against the place she used to call home. Instead, the glass in her hand fell and exploded across the floor like a confession deciding it didn't want to be held anymore. Her eyes didn't bloom, they widened. Terror has a shape, and I recognized it instantly. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of being seen. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then I heard a footstep on the stairs above me. Before we continue, thank you so much for your support. Every like, comment, and view means the world to us. We're on a mission to reach our first 1,000 subscribers, and we'd love for you to be part of that journey. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and let's grow together. Now, let's proceed. Measured, unhurried, the kind of footstep that belongs to someone who believes he belongs. He appeared with his hand skimming the banister as if it had been molded to his palm. My wife's stepbrother. To my children, he was uncle. A placeholder for comfort, a reliable stand-in for the space my work created. Before marriage, my wife had called her history with him a lapse, a page dog-eared by shame and closed for good. I believed her because love makes convenient sense feel noble. He smiled a shade too slow and let the quiet sit around us like a guest introduced by nobody. My daughter's face tipped toward him the way flowers bend toward a light source. My son hovered in the doorway to the living room, eyes bright and confused in the way a boy's eyes shine when two versions of his life are fighting for a single name. In that first minute, more shifted than furniture ever could. I was home, but home had been rehearsing without me. We ate at the table I had sanded and stained during the winter we couldn't afford new. Tradition dressed the plates as if it could smother new facts with gravy. He told stories that landed just right because he'd learned the rhythm of their laughs. He reached for the salt before I did, poured my daughter a second glass of cider without asking, and fielded my son's questions about motors and magnets with an ease I recognized as practice. My wife kept managing the fragments, plate, napkin, smile, while missing the only thing that mattered, the weight of her glance. When it slid to him and then snapped back to me, I saw the old lie turn from rumor into architecture. But even then I said nothing. Storms are survived by men who resist the theater of panic. I forked turkey, nodded at school updates, and concentrated on the slow, steady work of breathing through humiliation like it was smoke I didn't intend to inhale. Night rearranged the house into its honest shape. Bedrooms accepted bodies. Light pooled where doors were left ajar. I lay beside my wife and watched the ceiling. The rig followed me into the dark, the sway, the throb, the way steel complains in weather, and the same rule still applied. Never fight the wave that is already breaking. She exhaled in careful rhythms, the practiced breath of someone trying not to dream too loudly. I thought of missed birthdays I'd promised to make up and never quite did, videos of school plays I watched on a bunk with a plastic fork still in my hand, the winter my son learned to skate from a neighbor because I was coaxing a stubborn Valve to behave. I thought of the Sunday my daughter finally called me Dad, and how I replayed those 3 letters until they wore a groove into the place I stored joy. Rage arrived like a volunteer, eager, full of suggestions. I thanked it for coming and asked it to wait outside. What I needed was colder. Morning changed the house's language from ceremony to routine. The kettle pretended nothing had happened. Cabinets opened to the same angles. But routine, like any honest narrator, kept slipping details. A second coffee mug in the wrong cabinet. A key hung on a hook that never existed. Shoes parked by the door with the soles half scrubbed. Not my brand, not my gait. He descended in a t-shirt that wasn't his and told my son where the duct tape lived before I could answer. He lifted my daughter's backpack with that familiar, small grunt men make when they've done something 100 times. He asked my wife whether the clinic had returned her call and said it in the tone of someone who had been told he deserved to know. I drank coffee without sugar because sweetness felt like profanity, and I took inventory without writing anything down. Ready men can list their losses without letting the list recruit them. I toured the house like a man reacquainting himself with a crime scene he technically still owned. The guest room smelled like deodorant designed by a committee to resemble a forest. The closet had organized itself around shoulders broader than mine but shorter, exactly so many shirts to map a work week with an optimism problem. Mail addressed to him was tucked between circulars like it knew it didn't have the right to stand alone. The garage pegboard suddenly believed in symmetry and held tools I'd never buy. The wrench set gleamed with the self-respect of recent purchase. On the hallway table, a phone my wife had retired gave up its ghost in the form of silent notifications from a winter when the world decided distance could be justified by invoices. I didn't open apps. Knowing is fuel. Proof is timing. I went outside, stood by a hedge I never trimmed well, and listened to the neighborhood agree that nothing big had changed. Our neighbor waved the way people wave at a veteran they suspect might prefer not to talk. He said it was good to see me back. He said my brother-in-law had been solid, the kind of guy who kept a driveway clear, knew when to bring a bin to the curb for you if you forgot, and used the right plywood for patching a fence. He said it like two men bragging about competence could paper over loneliness. Feels like almost a year, he added, doing the quick math that embarrassment requires. I thanked him. I told him work was work and home was where I intended to be. The truth is better when it doesn't try to compensate for itself. At dinner that second night, my daughter reported small glories. A teacher who had stopped mispronouncing her name. A quiz she'd aced, the way Uncle had adjusted the router for a cleaner connection in her room. I asked to see the essay she was drafting. She shrugged like that made me a supervisor and handed it over anyway. Her paragraphs had muscle and mistakes in equal measure. I pointed to a sentence that wanted a stronger verb the way a beam wants another bracket and told her so. She rolled her eyes in the ceremonial way of teenagers who need the ritual to keep things honest. My son hovered with a sketch of a motor on 3 index cards and asked whether a brace made more difference on the left or the right. We'll test both, I said. Though we landed. Men lose everything when they start boasting about being needed. They win quietly when they show up for dull details with affection and a pencil. In the house is midnight. I traded anger for arithmetic. I opened a laptop and listed accounts in a column that refused drama. Offshore wages gave me a lever. Levers are the whole game. Joint accounts lost their joints. Savings slid into a trust with a name boring enough to deflect curiosity. Credit cards learned new limits. Notifications began to prefer my phone. I called a lawyer I trusted because he smiled like a shark only when necessary and never confused speed with spectacle. I said I needed discretion and architecture. He asked for the foundation. The deed, the titles, the insurance, the schedules, the small print that ends up deciding what was meant by everything. We laid out a plan that used institutions like wind, indifferent, reliable, deadly to men who mistake stubbornness for physics. I set a few small cameras, which is not as sneaky as it sounds when you have a legal right to your own sightline. The living room camera my wife had insisted on the year we tried to train the dog retrieved a cloud account eager to serve. Algorithms labeled my people with sincerity, my son, explorer, my daughter, performer, my wife, home, and the man I intended to move out of my story, helper. It made a kind of sad sense. Machines mimic who we pretend to be. I scrolled without martyrdom. Timestamps confirm what intuition refuses to litigate. I saw hands brush where they shouldn't linger, glances that forgot to apologize. Nothing pornographic, nothing that would appeal to the sordid appetite of gossip. Just the patient arithmetic of intimacy reasserting itself where it had previously been told to leave. I took a breath long enough to touch my ribs from the inside and pressed the laptop closed. Evidence is a tool. A tool works best when you're not trying to break something with it. Confrontation is a word that sells more tickets than it should. I waited until morning and asked my wife in the kitchen if loneliness had convinced her that shortcuts were paths. She did not pretend confusion. Her face changed in the tiny ways that count as honesty when people are out of practice. She said she didn't plan it, which is true of most fires. She said she was ashamed, which I believed at least for the span of that sentence. Then she cried the small, careful tears of someone trying to moderate sympathy. "I'm not leaving," I said. "I'm deciding." She flinched, because choosing to stay sounds like a sentence when you've been residing in improvisation. I kissed my son's head on my way out of the kitchen, not to prove anything, but because that is the work. My daughter came armed with her version later that day. She discovered, in the minor chaos of searching for a charger, a text from HR to his phone. Adolescents have no patience for process and even less for nuance. "What did you do?" she demanded, as if justice were a scuttlebug you could squash with a boot if you caught it early. I told her I'd asked questions institutions like asking themselves. I mentioned codes of conduct she would eventually read when she took a job that asked more than it promised. She said I was jealous and small, and that maybe I should have stayed away because things had been easier. Small, jealous, away. 3 words I let pass through me like wind through scaffolding. I told her I loved her, told her I wouldn't force her to choose allegiance like it was a country. She slammed her door because a door needs to be slammed every so often or it forgets it can close. The first email I sent wore a gray suit and carried a briefcase. It went to HR with the sober courtesy that makes gatekeepers lean forward. I detailed domestic circumstances that could create reputational conflict. I attached images with times and dates and the polite suggestion that company vehicles should sleep at company addresses on weekends. I did not accuse. I invited standards to speak for themselves. The second packet traveled to the places where a man's narrative keeps him afloat. A mentor, a sibling half distant by history, and the leader of a volunteer group that had, until recently, loaned him a halo. I asked questions in a tone that would not frighten children reading over shoulders. People who like to believe in goodness often conduct their own trials from the bench of disappointment. The third move was to look up our homeowners association clauses because the petty agreements we sign and forget can become handrails when the stairs get steep. Suspension came wrapped in corporate pity. My wife tried to make it sound like a scheduling inconvenience. He called it a misunderstanding and said the word misinterpretation with the devotion of someone who believes the correct syllable can reverse an earthquake. I didn't smile. I took my son to the hardware store for a longer bolt and let him choose the washers. He took his time because choices matter when you're 8 and also when you're 40. When we got home, we tested the motor brace on the left and then the right. He charted the vibrations like a scientist whose grant depended on being careful. He looked up at me after our third trial and said, "Sometimes 1 inch is the whole difference." I told him that was an entire sermon. We taped the chart to the wall above his desk, where it could keep being true in other ways. On day 3 of his suspension, I served notice that the guest room would be required for its original purpose and that non-family occupants needed to vacate within 10 days. The letter cited clauses so boring they might as well have been laws. He laughed when he read the first paragraph, sneered by the second, and went silent by the fourth. He showed it to my wife as if she could convert text into vapor with a sympathetic look. She stared at me instead, the way you stare at a map that just revealed the miles you still have to walk. "We'll follow the process," I said. The locksmith came the next morning. Doors forgot they had been aspiring to arches and remembered hinges were not metaphors. The argument my wife and I eventually had was surgical rather than cinematic. We sat at the edge of our bed because edges require balance. I asked her what she wanted our son to learn. That loyalty can be deferred to convenience, that intimacy is a chore chart, that the man who leaves to keep the lights on forfeits his claim to light. She said she was lonely. I said I knew. She cried in the register of someone who doesn't want to wake the person in the next room with their honesty. I told her I would not burn the house down. She looked relieved, and then told her fire wasn't the only purifier. She looked scared. We wrote rules the way people write vows after they discover vows require a manual. Counseling with someone who would not confuse forgiveness with amnesia. Accounts that needed 2 signatures for movement. Camera access shared because privacy had been misused. My son's schedule redesigned around presence rather than apology. She agreed because she was out of rhetoric. He packed without ceremony. Men who've practiced swagger often exit like stagehands. My daughter hovered, fury dressed as loyalty. He promised Sunday breakfast as if planning were proof. She asked whether I had pushed him out. He lied, said he needed space to sort out a work matter and that it wasn't about the house. I let the lie breathe because some lies need to suffocate without help. At the curb, he tried a parting shot. "You didn't have to do it like this," he said, trying to find a footing that would put me on a lower stair. "This way is clean," I said. "Clean lasts." He wanted a spectacle. I gave him logistics. The trunk shut. The car left. The house exhaled without bragging about it. Afterward, silence didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived like a thermostat you finally remember how to set. My wife made eggs the way I like them because eggs can become apologies if you handle the pan right. My son asked if we could test a brace idea he'd thought of at school and then surprised himself by discovering it worked. My daughter texted that she needed space, that I shouldn't make mom feel guilty, that she was fine, which is a vocabulary word teenagers deploy when they are not. I wrote back I loved her and that the porch light would stay on. I did not add that love is not permission for a person to outsource their conscience. Lessons ripen on their own schedules. We began counseling. It was not charming. People think counselors distribute forgiveness like coupons. Ours distributed questions like wrenches. My wife said loud truths and quiet ones. That loneliness had layered itself over years until it felt like a second mattress. That being admired for endurance is different from being treasured for presence. That old shame had disguised itself as long-standing comfort, and comfort had mistaken itself for harmlessness. I said the thing men like me should be made to say before we get rings, that providing can become an alibi for absence. That devotion to labor can calcify into a refusal to diversify love, that I'd turn my back on small rituals because I was busy failing at grand gestures. We did not absolve, we assigned. Tuesdays were for lists. Thursdays were for walking around the block and saying what we wouldn't say at breakfast. Sundays were for my son's science and my daughter's opinions when she came by for dessert wearing skepticism and softness in alternating layers. I moved the trust documents to a safe deposit box and left the key where the right people could find it if the ocean ever decided it wanted me. I kept no trophy drawer labeled justice. Instead, I collected ordinary competence. A garbage schedule memorized, a coil of plumber's tape in the drawer where chaos used to nap, an envelope for receipts because I wanted history to have an accurate accountant. I returned the spare key to the shed to a hook only I use and felt something as small and large as return click into place. Months marched like they always do when you're making a life instead of a legend. My son learned where to put his hands when a drill bit grabs and wants to run. My wife learned how to tell me she was afraid without wrapping the fear in a complaint. I learned to ask my daughter's opinions about films I didn't like because respect is not a bribe, it's an atmosphere. Uncle became an absence that did not beg to be discussed. When my son asked about him, I said, honestly, that some people visit a house to help and some visit to be helped and forget to leave. He nodded, then asked if we could try a different brace material. Children accept metaphors faster than adults because they haven't yet convinced themselves that life should be literal. Thanksgiving returned like a test you study for because last year took you by surprise. We prepped too much food because abundance is a relief you can eat. My daughter arrived late and hovered near the door with her coat still in hand. She watched me carve the turkey as if precision might exonerate me. My son performed our motor experiment for her on the kitchen island, explaining how a small shift in support changed the whole pattern of vibration, and she smiled at him with genuine light. My wife met my eyes and didn't look away. We ate. We told stories we didn't know the room, but offered anyway. After pie, my daughter leaned her head against my shoulder for exactly 7 seconds, which is longer than it sounds. On her way out, she asked if the porch light thing was literal. Always, I said, and meant it. At night, when the house returned to the honest hush that blesses a place where harm has been evicted without drama, I stood in the doorway where a year earlier a glass had taught the floor about gravity. I placed my hand on the banister and felt varnish warmed by the day's touch. I thought about the versions of me that had lined up in possible futures. The man who chose fireworks and lawyers with teeth and children drafted as jurors. The man who fled into an apartment with 2 white walls and visited on even weekends. The man who broke irreparably what could have been trued with patience and screws. Then I thought about the man I decided to be in the single minute it takes to close a laptop and keep breathing. A patient engineer of order. I do not misunderstand my victory. It was not partial, it was precise. I did not win back anyone as if humans were trophies captured by louder claims. I reasserted the basic geometry of the life I signed up to build. Me with my wife, raising our son with more presence than alibis, and keeping a space at the table for a daughter who wants to test whether love can make room without becoming a doormat. The stepbrother learned that reputations rented on charm have leases that terminate under light. My wife learned that comfort can metastasize into cowardice if you forget to feed it truth. I learned that steel, once it has been asked to hold, wants to keep holding if you maintain it. None of us learn these things on the first try. Sometimes, very late, I wake and listen to my wife breathe, not for evidence, but for cadence. I listen for the honest hiccup that signals dreaming. I watch the curtains tremble just slightly, because a house with its confidence restored remembers how to keep a breeze. I picture my son at 20 building something that stays built, and my daughter at whatever age she chooses to be when she learns that strength and stubbornness are cousins who don't always get along. I bless the ordinary. The slow drip of the bathroom faucet I keep promising to fix, the smudge on the baseboard I keep meaning to scrub, the folded laundry leaning into a topple because somebody underestimated a stack's tolerance. There is a holiness in underestimated stacks. People ask, quietly, how I didn't lose my mind. The truest answer is that I chose to use my mind where it could make a difference. I refused to turn my pain into a broadcast. I turned it into a system. I wrote letters. I kept records. I learned or relearned the contours of a family not as a stage, but as a set of interlocking obligations that can either starve or thrive, depending on who bothers to feed them. I worked like I was on a night shift that would only end when the gauges settled into the green again. And when they did, I didn't throw a switch and call it over. I started checking the gauges in the morning, too. I remember that first sound, the measured footstep, the hand on the banister. I remember the last sound of that era, the trunk closing on boxes that didn't want to be in them. Between those sounds lived a year of method. It would have been easier to explode. It would have been more dramatic to lay everything bare in front of children who had not yet chosen whether to be kind witnesses or restless jurors. It would have been easier to quit the very thing I had left to build, the fragile, daily architecture of us. I picked the harder thing. It left fewer scorch marks for my son to trip over in the dark. It left a path for my daughter to recognize from the end of a street when she needs to come home and negotiate with her pride. I am not naive about endings. Life rarely gives you a curtain and a bow. What it gives, if you earn it, is maintenance and a key you keep where you won't forget it. The shed key sits on its hook. The trust key lives in a pocket where my fingers sometimes go just to feel the cool outline and remember the difference between possession and stewardship. I sweep the porch not because someone is coming, but because someone might. I schedule counseling even in good weeks. I learned the boring names of the parts in my son's projects because a father should be fluent in the language of his child's concentration. I love my wife with less performance and more checks. On the smoke detectors, on the calendar, on the small assumption that habits are faithful just because they're familiar. And every year, when Thanksgiving returns with its insistence on gratitude, I lay a table that knows exactly who sits where, not as a claim, but as a promise. I carve with respect for the muscle memory of a blade used well. I pass plates in the direction that keeps our easy handoffs easy. I listen for laughter and also for silence, because silence tells the truth when laughter gets ambitious. I look at my son and see a boy who knows what steadiness looks like from the inside. I look at my wife and see a woman who learned the cost of shortcuts and decided to pay in patience instead. Sometimes my daughter walks in late, braced in case love comes with a lecture, and I remind her that in this house the porch light still means what it always meant. We are here, and we are not keeping score the way the world does, but in a way that lets a life grow tall without leaning. I came through the door a year ago expecting to be met by joy and found a test instead. I did not pass it with eloquence or force. I passed it with a ledger, with 3 emails, with a locksmith's invoice, with rules written on paper, with a boy's chart of vibrations proving what science and family have in common. Small supports, placed well, change everything. That is my revenge, not spectacle, not damage. Order. Boundaries. A home that answers when I say softly into its rooms, I'm here, and hears me because I never again let it forget my voice. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us.